What is the ultimate ambition of a man who has $270 billion? What project could possibly compel an 81-year-old to orchestrate what might be the most audacious consolidation of media, technology, and geopolitical power in modern history? We are living through the most radical consolidation of power since the Gilded Age, but we experience it as this disconnected stream of headlines. A media merger here, an AI breakthrough there, a political endorsement. Each development feels urgent but isolated, and we're left with this sense of unease but no clear map of the landscape that's being built around us. This series exists to connect those dots, and at the center of it all is Larry Ellison, a man who most people have never heard of despite him being the second richest person alive. Hi, I'm Dre. I run the Dre Dossier. I've been following Larry Ellison for a couple of years now, and I've compiled that investigative reporting in a 13-part series on my Substack called Who TF Am I Working For? Every source is cited and linked in my Substack, so I'll put that in the description below. And a lot of what I'm presenting in this video comes from that work, combined with Mike Wilson's brilliant biography he wrote on Larry Ellison called The Difference Between God and Larry Ellison. God doesn't think he's Larry Ellison. And honestly, there has never been a better title written for a book, nay, a better title to describe a man. So what has Larry Ellison been building? Last year, his family acquired Paramount Pictures and CBS. This year, he purchased TikTok through a consortium that he controls a majority of. He's now in a hostile pursuit for Warner Brothers Discovery, which at minimum would give him CNN and the Discovery networks. Oh, and that $300 billion contract between OpenAI and Oracle? Well, that's his infrastructure becoming the engine room of an AI revolution. You know, for philanthropic reasons. And if you're wondering why you should care about some tech billionaire that you've never heard of, it's because you're already in his systems. If you've been to a hospital, if you've applied for a loan, if you've used TikTok, your data has flowed through Oracle's infrastructure at some point. He's not building products that you can choose to buy. He's building the pipes that everything else runs through. And now he's consolidating control over media that would report on what those systems are actually doing. Now, telling the story of Larry Ellison is complicated, and it's mostly complicated because he's a pathological liar. And this is not coming from somebody who's biased either, okay? This is coming from the people who were the closest to him throughout their entire lives. He's forged university acceptance letters and presented them to his friends and family to be celebrated. He's fabricated dramatic stories about his childhood that even his own family members say never happened. He embellishes his own denials, making stories more outrageous even as he claims to debunk them. Karen Ruski, his first girlfriend and his first love, put it this way: "You never knew if you could believe anything he said. I still don't." When you're dealing with someone who has spent their entire lives constructing alternate realities, it becomes nearly impossible to separate fact from fiction. And maybe that's the point. Maybe for someone whose greatest fear has always been being dismissed or forgotten, rewriting reality becomes a form of survival. There's one constant in Larry Ellison's life, one thing he's never lied about because, well, he's never had to hide it: his belief in surveillance. It's the through line of his entire career, and in order to understand it, you need to start where it began. 1977, when his fledgling company won its first major contract to build a database for the Central Intelligence Agency. The project's code name was Oracle. This is where the story begins, and we'll move through his history non-linearly. We'll go to China, Israel, back to the United States, following the evolution of these surveillance systems rather than a neat biographical timeline. Let's get to his work with the CIA because this was his formative education. Oracle became a publicly traded company before it made anybody rich, and before Larry Ellison became the second richest person alive. It was a tool for the surveillance state. Is a tool for the surveillance state. The CIA had a problem that every intelligence agency in history has always had: too much information and no way to make sense of it. Reports from field agents, surveillance photographs, intercepted communications, financial records, mountains and mountains of data about people, places, movements, all of it disconnected, and all of it useless if you can't search it, cross-reference it, and find patterns hidden inside of it. Ellison's job was to build the infrastructure that could do that, to take the chaos and turn it into something queryable, something useful, something that could tell you not just what happened, but what might happen next. And he learned something fundamental in those early days, something that would shape everything he built for the next 50 years, which is the simple fact that human activity isn't random. It feels random when you're living it, sure, when you're the person making decisions about where to go, who to call, what to say. But from above, from the perspective of someone who can see all of that data at once, human behavior looks rather predictable. It follows patterns, and patterns, once you can see them clearly enough, can be controlled. And this was more than just a technical lesson. This was a philosophical revelation. The CIA didn't just teach him how to build databases. They taught him how to see the world. But here's a fun fact that not a lot of people seem to know about Oracle's origin story. Despite what Ellison might tell you, he did not invent the technology that made any of this possible. IBM did. In 1970, an IBM researcher named Ted Codd published a paper that would change computing forever. He described something called a relational database, a way to organize information so that you could ask questions to your data, questions that you hadn't thought to ask when you first collected it. Before this, databases were incredibly rigid. You had to know exactly what it was you wanted to find before you even built the system. You could query across categories, find connections that you hadn't anticipated, ask new questions as your needs evolved. So you can imagine that for intelligence agencies who are drowning in information, this was revolutionary. And for corporations trying to understand their own operations, this was a competitive advantage worth billions. IBM knew they had something special, so they spent years perfecting it in a project called System R. They built a working prototype, tested it extensively, and refined the design until it was elegant and powerful. And then they did something remarkable. They published everything. White papers explaining exactly how it worked, exactly how to build it, and exactly how to make it run efficiently. They wanted to set the standard for the industry. They wanted to let everyone know that IBM had invented the future of data storage. Not the most riveting, I know, but trust me, this is imperative to understanding Larry Ellison's villain origin story. Because IBM had a problem, and that problem was their own success. They were already making a fortune selling an older kind of database system. Hierarchical databases that required expensive IBM mainframes and teams of specialists in order to maintain. If they brought this new relational database to the market too quickly or too aggressively, they'd be essentially competing with themselves. They'd be cannibalizing their own revenue, disrupting their customer relationships, and undermining the very product that was making them rich. So this relational database sat in IBM's research lab, fully functional, fully revolutionary, while the executives in Armonk debated on what to do about it. Should they wait until their old products had run their course? Should they introduce it slowly and carefully as to not spook their existing customers? Should they license it to other companies and collect royalties? The discussions dragged on, quarters turned to years. Meanwhile, Larry Ellison had read those white papers. All of them. He understood technology, but more importantly, he understood what IBM's bureaucracy couldn't quite process. Whoever shipped this first would own the future. Not whoever invented it, not whoever had the best research labs or the most prestigious brand, whoever moved the fastest. This guy. So he did exactly that. He took IBM's published research that they had generously made available to the public, and built a working version of IBM's systems faster than IBM could navigate its own internal politics. He cut corners where IBM was careful. He shipped software that was buggy where IBM insisted on perfection. He moved with the kind of reckless speed that's only possible when you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. And by the time IBM finally introduced their product in 1982, Oracle already had a bunch of customers, including the CIA. By 1985, when IBM released their full enterprise version, Ellison was already rich. He had beaten them to the market with their own invention. Yeah, he essentially just reheated IBM's nachos, served them first, and called them his own recipe. And here's what that taught him, what became the bedrock of everything that he would build. If you can read someone else's blueprint and move faster than they can, then you don't need to invent anything. You don't need to be the smartest person in the room, though it helps if you think you are. You need to be ruthless about timing. You need to see the opening before anyone else does, and you need to move before anyone realizes what's happening. And this became his entire playbook. Not innovation, not creation, execution. And all of these lessons combined created his entire worldview. Any system, no matter how complex, can be debugged, optimized, and controlled. He saw the world in terms of systems. Politics is a system, markets are a system, the human body is a system, media is a system. And if you can see the underlying code, if you can identify the patterns and move fast enough, you can control all of it. Now let's push data aside for a moment and go back to who Larry Ellison is, like fundamentally as a human being. And this is where understanding Larry Ellison gets genuinely complicated because this man is a study in contradictions. He was adopted as an infant into a Jewish family in Chicago. That family just so happened to be his mother's sister. He wouldn't learn any of this until he's like 12 years old, though. And his adopted mother, Lillian, and his father, Louis Ellison, raised him in a traditional Jewish household. But Larry says that he rejected Judaism for basically his entire life. He even refused to have a bar mitzvah, publicly calling the religion interesting mythology at best. Yet, despite all of that, somehow he's turned into this rampant Zionist who's obsessed with Israeli national security, someone who has poured billions into Israeli surveillance infrastructure and speaks about the country's survival with the fervor of a true believer. Contradictions. He spent decades LARPing as a samurai tycoon, building these elaborate feudal Japanese estates complete with koi ponds and seismic retrofits. Commissioning traditional tea houses and importing craftsmen from Kyoto, like wrapping himself in these aesthetics of Bushido honor and ancient Eastern wisdom. Yet he's made billions building surveillance systems for the Chinese government, the same government who, by the way, crushed students under tanks and erased a massacre from history. But we'll get into that in a second. He positions himself as this American patriot who wants to protect his citizens in times of crises, as someone who offers Oracle's technology for free after 9/11 in the name of national security. Someone who will generously hold TikTok's data for national security reasons until we can figure out what to do with it. Yet that same technology has been used to track American protesters in real time, fusing their tweets with police records to predict dissent before anyone can organize, turning constitutional rights into data points and surveillance dashboards. The patriotism isn't the point. What matters is the pattern that he's identified. Governments in crisis will pay anything for security. The proof of concept was drafted abroad, in a city still washing blood from its streets. Which brings us to Beijing, China. In June of 1989, Beijing's Tiananmen Square became one of the most haunting events in modern history. For weeks, students and workers would peacefully gather there out of protest. They wanted what people everywhere want, the right to speak freely, to read an uncensored newspaper, to have a say in their future. They built this goddess statue out of paper mache, and they would sing all night and debate about what China could become. And the government's answer came at dawn. It was barely dawn on that summer morning when a fleet of tanks came rolling into Tiananmen Square, crushing the tent cities. Soldiers fired into crowds of unarmed students. Bodies piled up. Parents were frantically searching for their children. This massacre went on for hours until Tiananmen Square was empty, or at least it was quiet. The true death toll has never been confirmed. Many say hundreds, more say thousands. There wasn't enough time to count. Bodies were cremated quickly. Hospitals were ordered not to keep records, and witnesses just disappeared. And then China did something even more chilling. They erased it. Newspapers were shut down, journalists vanished, state media called it a counter-revolutionary riot, and these students were troublemakers and they got what they deserved. The lengths in which this government went to erase this massacre from history is astounding. Almost all footage was confiscated. Even today, there's hardly any physical record of this massacre having taken place. All but a handful of film footage was confiscated. Photographs were destroyed, and speaking the words June 4th became grounds for arrest. Sound familiar? Charlie Kirk. And let's just say that the morale wasn't so great in China at the time. So the government decided that within months they were going to launch the Patriotic Education Campaign. God, every government uses the same playbook, don't they? Suddenly, everything was about China's glorious 5,000-year-old heritage, Confucian philosophy, the Great Wall, and ancient emperors. The message was crystal clear, because China is eternal. The Communist Party is just the latest guardian of an unbroken civilization. And to question the party is to question China itself. And it worked. Most kids grow up in China today never having even heard of Tiananmen Square, or if they have, they're told that this is just a Western conspiracy and this is all a CIA psyop. Don't believe me? Well, go look at a TikTok video I posted about this very thing a few months ago, and the comments are flooded with young Chinese users who were absolutely convinced that this has never happened. They called it Western propaganda. They were citing news articles about how this was a great myth of the CIA, and it really did not feel like they were trolling. Like, it felt like they genuinely believed this. I even almost believed it. I was like, what, did this maybe not happen? Because when you go to Google it, there's almost no video footage of this, except for like 1 or 2 videos, I think, from the BBC that were able to actually get this footage out of the country. A random aside, but if you use DeepSeek AI, China's open source AI model, and you try to talk about Tiananmen Square or any of this, not only will it refuse to engage in this conversation, but one time I was kicked out of my account. I asked one question about Tiananmen Square, it refused to engage with it, I asked why, and all of a sudden, I was logged out of my account. Can't log back on. Their government has successfully made one of the most photographed, filmed, and internationally witnessed massacres just disappear. You can delete a photograph, you can even delete a person, but how do you delete the memory from an entire country? Well, you would need 2 things: control over what people can read and watch, and the ability to track anyone who tries to remember. That's right, enter Larry Ellison. See, most Western companies at the time looked at post-Tiananmen China as a moral line that they just couldn't cross. International outrage was deafening, sanctions were being discussed, and business relationships just froze. But Larry Ellison saw post-Tiananmen China as an opportunity, as a new customer. Do you guys see why I track this guy all the time? He's insidious. It gets so much worse. It gets so much worse. You see, he saw a government who had just learned that it desperately needed better databases, it needed a better way to track people, and it needed ways to identify dissent before it could spread. A government who would pay whatever it costs to make sure that students never gathered in a square like that again. So while other companies were moving out, Oracle secretly started moving in. And because of Larry Ellison's obsession with Asian aesthetics, he understood something deeper. To do business in China after what just happened, you couldn't just show up as an American tech company who used to work with the CIA. You needed some sort of cultural legitimacy. Right as the Communist Party was reviving Oracle bones, these ancient cracked bones that emperors would use to divine the future, Oracle, the database company, decided it was going to adopt the Chinese name Jiagu Wen, which is Oracle bone inscriptions. Like, think about that. A database company that's selling surveillance tools to a government that's actively erasing a massacre from history brands itself as the spiritual heir to the bones of ancient Chinese emperors who used to make decisions about war and the fate of kingdoms. And that wasn't just a cute translation, it was poetry, it was a promise. Larry Ellison was saying, I understand what you're building, and we can help. And that they did. Now it's time we hop back across the pond over to the US, because the date is September 11th, 2001. I told you guys I'd have a fun YouTube account. Nearly 3,000 people died that morning, and Americans across the country were watching the towers collapse on live television over and over again until the images were just burned into our collective memory. And the fear and grief hardened overnight into political demand. The rallying cry was, keep us safe at all costs. And our rallying cries seemed to be heard because within days, Larry Ellison appeared on national television offering Oracle software for free to build a national ID system, one centralized database that's holding every American's personal information and is instantly accessible to government agencies. Yeah, how much you want to bet his personal information wouldn't be in there? And within my research for this, going back and forth between China and the US, I started to notice this pattern, something that was happening in China at the same time. In the spring of 2001, the Chinese government had approved something called the Golden Shield Project. And just to give you an idea of how quickly this was implemented, on April 25th, the State Council signed off, May 30th, the Planning Commission approved it, and on July 11th, a joint directive set implementation into motion. It was this nationwide police-run system that built the technical foundation for the country's modern internet surveillance censorship. Think of it as the early infrastructure that lets the government monitor online activity and to help suppress dissent. Like what happened to me with DeepSeek AI, this set the foundation for stuff like that. The government was able to do things like filter content and track individuals. Now, it's important to note that the Golden Shield Project was but one of 12 important golden projects for China at the time. I'm going to read off to you really quickly what the other golden projects were, because I think this is a roadmap for where we are headed. The other golden projects are Golden Customs, otherwise known as Golden Gate for customs, Golden Tax for taxation, Golden Macro, Golden Finance for financial management, golden auditing, golden security, golden agriculture for agricultural information, golden quality for quality supervision, golden water for water conservancy information, golden credit, and golden discipline projects. Oh no, but they will never do that in the US. Just wait till you hear what Larry Ellison did in 2012. By 2012, Chicago was preparing to host the NATO summit, and along with it, tens of thousands of protesters were expected to arrive. And Larry Ellison, catching wind of this, decided to approach the Chicago Police Department and tell him that he had a solution. So they pulled in Endeca, a search and analytics platform that Oracle had just acquired. It's the same concept as the Golden Shield Project, or Palantir, for instance. Fuse everything you know about a person into one searchable profile, a profile that is very closely linked to police records. And CPD, Chicago Police Department, used it to merge police records with real-time social media data. Every word they said was aggregated and fed into an Oracle database and used without their knowledge. And within 2 months, Oracle reps were caught using Chicago as a case study to sell surveillance packages to China. And by 2018, provincial police departments in Liaoning were listed as Oracle Analytics customers. Yep, American protest data became the training data for Chinese surveillance. That American protest data created infrastructure that would eventually enable mass detention of over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. And the detention camps in that part of the country are deplorable, subhuman. You thought you were just protesting NATO's military expansion? Well, turns out you were just teaching an algorithm how to identify dissidents and Uyghur Muslims for torture and abuse. It's so fucked. How is he not in jail? How is Larry Ellison not in jail? How is everybody who worked on that not in jail? All right, so what comes next? Why did I tell you all of this? Well, because I think it's important to understand how the pattern works. Especially when it comes to Larry Ellison, he's fairly consistent. A government faces a crisis, Oracle positions itself as the solution. The infrastructure gets built and the systems get refined, repackaged, and deployed somewhere else. Well, for now. And where do you think Ellison took everything that he learned? Where do you think he could conduct the most extreme version of what this infrastructure could possibly do? I'm sorry, you have to say it a little bit louder. Did you say Israel? Close, Gaza. He took it to Gaza. And that's what we'll be covering in part 2 of this series. The Netanyahu connection, the underground data bunkers that are 9 stories deep, AI-generated kill lists, and Tony Blair. Yep, the one helping Ellison sell the same infrastructure, but rebranded as a path to peace in the Middle East. And as hard as it can be to talk about and think about, it's important that we all know this stuff, because if we've learned anything from Oracle's relationship with China, it's that what gets tested overseas doesn't stay overseas. The same goes for Gaza. Like I said, if you want to check out any of my sources for this series, head over to my Substack, the Dre Dossier, and you'll find them at the bottom of every one of my articles. And when I said this technology is moving fast, I meant it. We're all basically in the system, probably. The question now is whether you can see it. I won't leave you on a horrible note. I'll leave you with a little bit of newt. Right? Makes it a little bit better, huh? Got anything to say? Word.